So we look here at how emotional disorders like anxiety and depression are the result of your brain treating emotional threats as if they were immediate physical dangers. And we do that by doing 4 steps, this fearless emotion management. We've already talked about this in prior weeks. We've talked about how to find yourself and your safety, that yourself is your frontal lobes, your conscious self. And then once we've kind of found ourselves and recognized that we're at least immediately physically safe, the next thing is to ease our lizard brain, our autonomic nervous system. That what we're trying to do here is to start managing that fight or flight or freeze response in the brain. And basically, we're going to use our bodies to calm our minds down. Then we started talking about how each of us have a security guard, a part of our brain dedicated to looking for and managing any kind of threats that we come across. The problem is this is a non-conscious part of our brain. It's really good at handling immediate physical threats. It's not very good at handling emotional threats or future threats. So we need, again, we're trying to return the control of emotional threats and future threats to our frontal lobes. So everything we do to assure the security guard is to help kind of settle it down, become good friends with it, essentially this non-conscious part of our brain, so that we can engage in our lives in the way that we'd like to. As we do this, things like anxiety and depression begin to decrease. So even if we have a biological propensity towards anxiety or depression, when we assure the security guard, we can decrease the amount of impact that has just by assuring our security guard. And probably in about 2 weeks from now, we'll begin talking more in depth about how repetition literally begins to rewire the brain and grow hope. So if you've missed any of our prior sessions, you can go to sites.google.com/view/fearless. And there you'll see links to a lot of the former workshops this semester. They're all put up on YouTube, so you can look at them there. Or just find out more information about fearless emotion management. It's all free. So post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is a learned fear in the brain. And we'll talk about how that process occurs. To do this, though, I want to give you a warning. The next slide, if you're squeamish or easily startled, you might want to look away from the screen as I share, maybe because this might be highly disturbing to some viewers. So I'm going to click that screen now, so just be aware of that. So some of you might, if you're still looking at your screen, you might be wondering, why in the world did Dallas just share this image and tell me that this was going to be scary? Well, most people wouldn't find a little puppy dog scary at all, of course. But let me introduce you to somebody who might have a different reaction to this image. And let me introduce you to my little nephew, Zachary. So when he's a little boy, he wandered into his neighbor's yard, and they happened to have several beagles. And when he wandered back into his own yard, his mother found him. And I know the image is kind of grainy. It's the best one I have. This is after he got back from the ER and had his face sewn back on. So he had wandered into the neighbor's yard, and the beagles, for some reason, had attacked him and tore open his cheek. So you might not be surprised that little Zachary might have a negative response to a cute little beagle. Something as gentle and kind as this little beagle looks, you might not be surprised that little Zachary wouldn't have had a very pleasant experience with that. The reason that this happens is little Zachary, just like all of us, has a security guard. It has that amygdala in the background trying to look out for him, trying to make sure that if he does get hurt, that it figures out what hurts him and tries to not let that happen again. So the security guard watched very closely as little Zachary experienced that painful experience with the beagle, and that information was encapsulated. That's put into kind of this rapid recall filing cabinet, and now Little Zachary has an automated fear response to the presence of beagles. And this makes sense. Most all of us would say, oh, okay, that makes sense why little Zachary might respond negatively to beagles. So I want to emphasize, so far, we haven't developed PTSD. Having this negative experience doesn't necessarily mean that little Zachary is going to experience PTSD. So I want to clarify a few things as we go forward. Little Zachary had a very negative experience, of course, with the beagle. His security guard was watching this process. And let's begin to watch what happens underneath when someone has a negative experience like this. Now, you might want to follow along. If you have maybe a mildly disturbing, mildly difficult event in your past and it still kind of bothers you, then you might want to go along with me here as I talk about what happened maybe to little Zachary. But I want to emphasize, this is not a therapy session. This is a workshop, so please don't bring up anything that is particularly difficult, like high intensity for you or really troubling. So either don't do this at all or make sure that whatever you bring up is only mildly bothersome to you. But if we think about little Zachary, we can start thinking in terms of what was coming in through his five senses. As he was being attacked by the beagle, what were the things that he was experiencing? So we can just start with hearing, right? What are the things that little Zachary might have been hearing? And we don't know for sure, nobody was there, but we could make some guesses that he probably heard something like growling, we could guess. He maybe heard barking. Maybe he heard a chain on the dog, because the dogs did have a chain on them, so they wouldn't get out of the yard. So maybe he heard the rattle of a chain. And maybe he heard his head brushing against the ground as he was being pounced on by the dog. There's lots of things he might have heard. Even some people have mentioned maybe he heard his own screaming. It's possible he may have heard his own screaming. What's important is to think about what was his security guard recording in that moment. So little Zachary might not be able to tell you, oh, I heard the chain or I heard the dogs barking. He might not remember any of that. But his unconscious brain, his amygdala, was back there gathering in all this information and trying to tie it to figure out what is causing us this much pain. Well, maybe it's these sounds, and these sounds are a signal of danger. So very rapidly, the security guard is connecting these sounds to possible evidence of danger. So we wouldn't be at all surprised then that if little Zachary hears a dog barking in the next few days, he might have quite a negative startle response to this. That wouldn't surprise us at all. Or maybe if he even hears a chain rattling, that might surprise us, but we wouldn't be surprised if we knew that he heard it during that event. Oh, of course he's startled by a chain rattling, because last time he heard a chain rattling, he got injured. So the security guard is just amazing at learning to try and make connections, all in an effort to keep little Zachary safe, right? So you might think about, again, only a mild experience, but you might think about your own experience. What was maybe you hearing? What was your security guard hearing? Probably, right? What kind of information was being processed down lower in your brain? And what was little Zachary smelling? What maybe was he smelling as he was being kind of mauled by this little beagle? Maybe he was smelling dog breath. People have brought that up. You know, he was in a backyard with grass. Maybe he was smelling grass. Maybe he was smelling earth. Again, we don't know for sure, so we're making guesses. People have mentioned maybe he was smelling blood. Whatever it was that he was smelling, little Zachary may not be able to recall and describe that to us. But it's very likely that his security guard was making a connection between maybe that smell of grass or cut lawn and danger. So we might not be at all surprised if we can see that little Zachary over the next few days is having a reaction when he smells someone's fresh cut lawn and suddenly becomes afraid. That's his security guard at work. His amygdala is making those connections, trying to make sure that little Zachary doesn't get hurt again. Again, very useful. And you can think about your own mildly difficult experiences, and what maybe was your brain connecting with these smells. Now, I spent a lot of time working with Vietnam vets and other veterans, but particularly Vietnam vets. And one of the things that the smell that they almost had difficulty overcoming for much of their life was just the smell of jet fuel or diesel fuel. It just triggered a lot of emotional reaction for them. They couldn't directly connect those things, but their body did. Their amygdalas had made that connection. And what was little Zachary touching? What were the sensations coming across his skin and his muscles? What were those things that he was feeling? Some people say, well, maybe he was on grass. He probably felt the grass on various parts of his skin. Again, he may not be able to recall that, but his security guard was back there making a connection between the sensation of grass and danger. He may have grabbed hold of the dog. Maybe he was feeling the fur of the dog as he's trying to push the dog off of him. In the weight of the dog, maybe the dog was on top of him. So the weight, so we wouldn't be at all surprised then if later somebody is just playing with little Zachary, but they get on top of him and their weight is on top of him, and he has a really strong fear response, almost a claustrophobic response. We wouldn't be surprised by that if we knew that his security guard linked that pressure on his body as evidence that he's about to be harmed in some way. So again, non-conscious stuff. Little Zachary may not remember any of this, and it's likely if you went through events like this, you wouldn't necessarily remember them either, but your security guard, your amygdala would have made those connections. The taste, what was he tasting? Again, think of your own mild experience. What maybe were you tasting during that experience that your security guard was linking up with whatever was happening that was painful, right? Maybe if he had chewing gum, it might be bubble gum. So we wouldn't be surprised if little Zachary didn't like to eat gum for a while, because when he put that flavor in his mouth, it caused a fear response. We wouldn't be surprised by that because his brain had made a link between the taste and the harm that he received. Right? And what was little Zachary seeing? What were his little eyes darting around seeing? All this input going through his eyeballs into his thalamus and then into the amygdala. And what was he seeing? He was probably seeing things that we would typically see in a backyard. Right? He was probably seeing trees and bushes, foliage. He was seeing toys, a swing set. Maybe he was seeing grass. Maybe he was seeing the ground. He was certainly seeing a beagle. Right? He was seeing all these things, and his security guard was taking note. Okay, all of these things then, at least from the security guard's viewpoint, all of these things might be indication that little Zachary's in danger. So then we wouldn't have to be surprised if little Zachary, at least for a few days or a little while after, doesn't want to go in the backyard. The moment his eyes see the backyard and the playthings and the toys and the grass and the trees, his little brain might say, oh no, something bad is about to happen, right? Because his security guard made that connection. And that's how this process goes, especially, this is all intensified. The bigger the traumatic experience, the more intense these kind of sensory inputs make an impact with our amygdala, with that security guard. So we wouldn't be at all surprised then if any of these sensations maybe triggered something for Zach in the following days and caused him to have a fear response. But it doesn't just stop there. Remember, we've talked before about how the security guard cannot tell the difference between reality and the things in our imagination, right? The security guard, the amygdala, is too far down in the brain to really distinguish what is reality and what is our imagination. It treats them very much the same. So we could start to wonder, what was little Zachary thinking about? What were the images that were coming to his mind as he laid there, as he was getting mauled by this dog? What were the thoughts in the kitchen? Some people had said, my guess is he probably was wondering, where's mom? Where's mom? So he's having this thought of the absence of mom becomes the equivalent of pain. Now, little Zachary didn't consciously come up with that, right? The security guard did. The security guard said, okay, there's no mom here, and we're in a lot of pain. Therefore, we wouldn't be surprised now that we see little Zachary being particularly clingy in the next few days, holding close to mom, not wanting to leave her side, making sure that he's always close to a caregiver, because not because he's thinking about being in danger, but because his brain has associated this security guard is making sure that he doesn't get hurt again. Right? So even what he's thinking about. But again, I want to emphasize this still is not PTSD. So even though now all these things might trigger a response, well, this is normal. This is a normal, healthy brain at work. A normal, healthy security guard, amygdala. It's supposed to happen this way. It's working hard to keep little Zachary safe. None of this is troublesome. This is very healthy. And in fact, 80% of the time, so little Zachary, if there's 5 kids that this happens to, 4 of them, with just a little further interaction with dogs, are going to actually kind of lose that fear response just with further interaction with the dogs. So, and it's true of all of us. If we have even big, scary experiences like car accidents or other things, assaults of any sort, people who go off to war, about 80% of the time, this differs depending on what kind of trauma it is, but about 80% of the time, our brains kind of resolve things. They realize that, oh, okay, not everything we saw or smelled or touched or heard actually is an indication of danger, and the brain sorts through this. However, about 20% of the time, and again, this depends on the nature of the trauma, but about 20% of the time, this process can kind of begin to get out of control. It can keep growing. So we could take, for example, we've already got all these associations that little Zach had, all the sensory input with, oh, all of this means fear. But his little brain might continue to try and look for ways to keep him safe. And it might continue this process of generalization and say, okay, little Zachary, now maybe it's not just beagles that are dangerous here. Maybe it's anything with 4 legs. Right? Maybe it's things that have 4 legs. Those are dangerous. So his little brain makes that association. Now anything with 4 legs is scary to him, and little Zachary starts to avoid them. And then his brain says, you know what? Maybe it's even more than just 4 legs. Maybe it's anything with fur. Maybe that's an indication of danger. So his brain says, okay, anything with fur. Now little Zachary is scared of anything that might have fur, right? He's having this negative fear response to that. And his brain can continue again and again. So maybe it's not just things with fur, but maybe it's anything that's not human. So maybe bugs and birds, maybe anything that's just not human shaped is dangerous to us. So his brain is just, in an effort to keep him safe, it's overgeneralizing, and to the point where little Zachary might now be scared of everything, and his world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is now what we call PTSD, and this is something that usually we look for about 6 months. If somebody is still experiencing symptoms of trauma and it's continuing to grow and further limit their life, this is what PTSD is all about. And again, we're going to look at this in about 6 months, because we expect that people will have a fear response immediately following, and maybe for a few weeks or a few months after a big event, and with time that it resolves. When it doesn't, now we're looking at PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Right? And by the way, all this information, I want to remind you, this is not things that I came up with. It's not my own research. This comes out of really good research from experts in the field, like Bessel van der Kolk, probably the premier researcher and well-respected person in this field and with trauma, and how the body and the brain are connected. And then also from the work of Stephen Porges and his work on polyvagal theory. When I talk about polyvagal theory, I talk about security guards and lizard brains and conscious self. He talks about it in slightly different terms, the more scientific terms. I just change them into these other ideas. So let's get back to this PTSD. And one of the ways to think about PTSD is just like if somebody were to have a broken leg or a broken arm, something, it literally changes the way they interact with their environment, right? Until that body part is healed, they literally interact with their environment differently. I know a few years back when I took some Boy Scouts snowboarding, and I, as their leader, ended up breaking my ankle, I interacted with my environment very differently for a couple of months as I tried to find new ways of getting around my environment. PTSD does something very similar, except in the brain. It literally changes, without the person's permission, it just changes the way a person interacts with the stimulus of their environment. So sometimes we actually call it a post-traumatic stress injury. You might hear that if you look at the literature. And it's a nice, accurate description of what might happen. That this injury in the brain, like a broken leg, changes the way the person interacts with their environment. Same kind of stimulus that they had before now can become very frightening, even though it's not actually dangerous. And what's nice is last year, 2019, in Idaho, they recognized this, and they passed a law that now allows people who experience PTSD on the job to receive compensation for it, just like they would any other physical injury, because there's an understanding that PTSD literally does something to the brain. And while we can do a lot of good things to help to heal it, it is very much like an injury in the brain. So just like everything else though, any other learned fear or compulsion, most fears are helpful, often PTSD is not. There are a few circumstances in which it's very valuable, but most of the time PTSD is one of those fears that might be helpful to unlearn. Right, so we're going to learn how to assure our security guard or deal with the movies in the mind, as we talked about before. We know how information gets in to the security guard and encapsulated, and we need to learn ways to get it out when those fears are not serving us, like for PTSD. So we're going to now give some time to JC, who is the intern here, the social work intern for us here. So we'll turn some time over now to JC to share one of the strategies that we can use to begin to unlearn fear responses.
What I'm going to show you guys actually is from a magazine article that's almost 100 years old. It's 91 years old. So try and hold back your doubts for a moment, because I promise you that there's going to be something useful to learn out of this. This is an article from the 1929 edition of Popular Mechanics, the issue of May 1929. And this is an interview with a man who was one of the most experienced pilots at this time. He had flown airplanes during World War I, and he had done a lot of other various types of test piloting as well. So he's giving this interview in this magazine, and I just want to read you a little quote from it. He says, "When my senses tell me one thing and the little dials on the instrument board tell me another, usually the dials are right. Next to the instruments, probably the pilot's safest guide to the position of his ship is the seat of his pants." So have you guys ever heard the phrase flying by the seat of your pants? I think hopefully most of you have heard of that. Essentially, that's a phrase that's stuck around since early aviators like this man, because the first airplanes were so small and light that flying around in the air with them was almost like driving a car. I'm sure we've all experienced the feeling where you accelerate really fast and it kind of pushes you back in your seat, or maybe someone has hit the brakes too fast and it kind of jerks you forward. There are similar sensations that happen when you're flying an airplane. If you, excuse me, you can know whether or not you're climbing or diving by how heavy or how light you feel in your seat. You can feel if the plane is tilting because one side will feel heavier than the other. So this kind of became an idiom that was used a lot by pilots, to fly by the seat of your pants, because the seat of your pants, that's what's connected most to the airplane, right? You've got the most contact, the gravity's holding you to the seat of your chair, and you can kind of feel the vibrations from the plane and how it's moving. But I just want to repeat this line. This pilot says, when my senses tell me one thing and the little dials on the instrument board tell me another, usually the dials are right. So what does this have to do with our amygdala, our security guard? So our security guard, our amygdala, like it's actually called, is categorizing all of this information for us, okay? And we might say that our security guard wants us to fly by the seat of our pants. Our security guard knows what certain things feel like. He knows if that means danger. And so he is being, on guard. He's constantly looking out for us, making sure that we're not going to be in those bad situations again. But unfortunately, he's not always the most accurate. Just like this pilot recommends to trust the instruments over your instincts, we need to trust reality over our security guard sometimes. So if we grew up in a perfect home life situation where we had a great relationship with everyone we ever knew and no one ever lied to us and all of our needs were met, then our feelings would be a great way to guide us. They would tell us when things were off and help us know when something's different. But that's not reality for any of us, because nobody's perfect. We all have imperfect parents, imperfect lives, imperfect friends. So these interpersonal interactions that we have with one another, our security guard sometimes gets confused and is telling us that something's wrong when it's not. And this goes back to what we talked about last week with, we're trying to change the meaning of these movies. The security guard, our amygdala, gets this input and sets off alarm bells and tells our lizard brain that we need to be in fight or flight mode. So, when you've gone through the first two steps, F, find yourself in your safety, E, ease your lizard brain, and then A, assure your security guard. This is what we do. We look around and we say, okay, my instincts and my feelings are telling me that something's wrong, but what is reality telling me? And it's kind of a little chance for us to check the instruments in our plane. We're not just going to fly by the seat of our pants and say, well, my amygdala says I need to freak out, so guess it's time to freak out. That's not necessarily always the best way to go. So check your instruments. That's the things that we talked about early. Get your head up, look around. Are you really in danger? If you're in a room on your own, like some of us might be right now, there's no one trying to hurt you. Your instruments, your eyes, your ears, your five senses can assure your security guard that it's wrong in this case. And it's, we're the pilot, we're the one in the driver's seat. We can take control and know that we can trust those instruments, our five senses and their input, over our security guard. So,
if you're interested, you can go to sites.google.com and you can find more of the prior workshops that we've done. There's connections to the YouTube link for those. Also, just a reminder for all students and employees at BYU Idaho, we have the Therapy Assistance Online, the TAO, which is, your subscription's already been paid for us, so it's a free resource for you. And there's also some free resources for anyone in the community during this COVID-19 epidemic. There's a wonderful resource if you or someone you care about is in crisis, is having thoughts of suicide or self-harm. There's a great resource here in Idaho. You just dial 211 if you're in Idaho, or here's the number if you're in other places. They know a lot of the resources throughout the state and can get people connected, or just help people walk through, hey, what can I do now when I'm struggling in this way? Or how could I help the person that I care about who's struggling? And then, of course, there's the National Hotline as well.